My name is Ian Scott. I am a doctoral student here at the University of Illinois in Educational Policy Studies. So I will be introducing our next presenter, Dr. Tina Trujillo. Dr. Trujillo is an assistant professor at the University of California, Berkeley Graduate School of Education. She earned her PhD in education from UCLA and her MA in education from the University of Colorado Boulder. She uses tools from political science and critical policy studies to study the political dimensions of urban district reform, the instructional and democratic consequences of high-stakes accountability policies for students of color and English learners, and trends in urban educational leadership. Her work is published in a range of journals, including American Education Research Journal, Teachers College Record, Journal of Educational Administration, and Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis. So, Dr. Trujillo.
Good morning. So I want to thank everybody for having us and for holding this conversation over these 2 days. I think this is a great size of a group to have a more in-depth conversation. I was saying to folks last night, to be able to actually get into sort of the nitty-gritty, the fine-grained details of the arguments that we're constructing and trying to understand better. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it. Before I start, I want to thank my co-author on the study that I'll be talking about today, Dr. Scott, who's also at Berkeley, also in the Department of Education with me. I want to give a little bit of background just very briefly, about how I came to be studying Teach for America along with Dr. Scott. So I actually got my start in education through Teach for America. So as full disclosure, I am an alum, and I've watched the organization sort of evolve over time, or adapt, perhaps is a better word, to the policy environment and other conditions over time. And when I came to Berkeley in 2008, I started talking with Professor Scott, who is also a TFA alum. And we started talking about what we wanted to do next in our study, or in our research. And we found that both of us had very similar sort of impressions of this organization. And one of the and the studies of it. And one of the strongest sort of impressions of the research, the early research on TFA at that time that we both had, was that the conversation was fairly narrow. When most people talked about Teach for America, either college students who were thinking about going into it, or researchers, or practitioners, or policymakers, they were talking about Teach for America's effects, right? Well, how effective is it in terms of test scores? And I appreciate that I'm able to go after Chris's presentation in particular, because I think the two kind of build on the two papers really build on one another, in that when we were thinking about conceptualizing Teach for America, I was not interested in conceptualizing it in terms of how impactful, how effective Teach for America is on students' educational outcomes as measured by standardized test scores. Not to completely dismiss the role of testing. It's part of the reality within which our children and communities and schools and adults live. But I found that conversation was lacking. And so we set out to think about a broader way to conceive of this organization that we see as a case of something much larger in education. Sometimes people say, well, why do you study TFA? I was just talking last night at dinner about this. And I don't study TFA just to understand TFA. I see TFA as a part of a larger political and ideological movement in education. And it's a good case of that. And so if we peer inside this case and try to understand how the organization is messaging, for example, around education and teacher preparation and educational policy, and how its recruits are taking certain career paths versus others, I think that's going to help us understand the broader sort of political and social changes in it that we see public education part of these days. So that's kind of where this study came from. So today, I'm going to talk with you about a paper that's in draft form that you all received before we came together. It's called Teach for America and the Movement to Remake Public Education. The purpose of this paper is to propose a new framework then, a new conceptual framework for studying TFA as a political and social movement, or that should really say as a case or a part of a broader political and social movement with implicit and explicit ideological and political underpinnings. Okay. So I'll talk with you about how we are sort of the steps that we took to arrive at this new framework. So it sounds like most folks in here are somewhat familiar with Teach for America. Raise your hand if you've participated in Teach for America.
Do you mean as a core member or just?
Oh, just actually had any involvement with the organization. Okay. Raise your hand if you've never heard of Teach for America. Okay, just trying to get a sense of who's in the room. So then I'll go over this very briefly, but as many of you I'm sure are well aware, originally when this organization started, and the details are all in the paper, in 1990 when Wendy Kopp, as a part of her honors thesis as an undergraduate student at Yale, when she originally conceived of the organization, she argued that TFA's purpose was to eradicate educational inequality by filling teacher shortages. And she reasoned that the consequence of filling these teacher shortages would be that for the core members themselves, the Teach for America teachers, they would become lifelong advocates for public education in any profession that they chose. So even though they would only work or be obligated, required to work, or expected to work for 2 years in an understaffed school and school district, they would presumably become lifelong advocates for public education. Today, if you look at TFA's website, that aim has shifted. And today they say that part of their mission now is to prepare their core members for social leadership. Right. That's their explicit purpose. Right? And so then the present consequence of this is that now that they've placed over 24, and now it's even more, I think even just since I wrote the paper, even more than 24,000 teachers in more than 35 public school districts around the country, and now increasingly many charters. They've done this, they've seeded multiple organizations here in the United States and abroad, including the Teach First and Teach for All programs that are sort of the analogous or sort of sister TFA programs in other countries. Now the consequence is that TFA is presumably a mechanism for launching the careers of elected officials and other social and government and educational leaders. Okay, so that's very different than the original presumed consequence. So how did we get here to this? Well, one of the sort of three developments in TFA's history that we go into detail into the paper, or that we detail in the paper, is that it was from the beginning, from the moment it was conceived, its leaders, its founders relied heavily on the private sector to push different teacher education policies and educational policies more generally. So Wendy Kopp, in both of her autobiographies, much of the other literature on TFA goes into the detail, or goes into the history of how they relied on so much corporate funding to begin with. Today they rely not just on a heavy amount of corporate funding to keep the organization afloat and different foundation funding, but also federal funding. So they've been able to sort of write themselves into federal funding legislation as well. Another dimension of their organizational evolution that we detail in the paper revolves around their emphasis on creating a movement of individual social entrepreneurs. So TFA started just as TFA. Eventually, they spun off another organization, Leadership for Educational Equity. This is a 501c3 organization. And as an alum, I still get various emails. Just this morning, I got another email from this organization saying, do you want to run for elected office? These are the 5 steps for doing it, and this is how we'll help you do it. And they will, this is an organization that will work with individual TFA recruits to learn how to position themselves to win different elected offices, everything from school boards to city council to what have you. And several have now become elected officials. Another thing sort of happened as TFA was developing over time, and that's that if you look at the way their spokespeople talk about the organization, they say, we don't endorse any particular reform or policy. We don't just support, we don't officially support merit pay. We don't officially support charter school expansion. We don't officially support specific policies. But what instead is they do, what they've done over time is you've seen that they've sort of had this almost tacit acceptance of the diminished role of the state to ensure resource equity between schools and across schools and school systems. And by that I mean that when you look at the types of leaders or alumni that they highlight in their marketing materials, in their correspondence with their alumni and with their funders and with the broader public, they highlight a certain type of recruit. And that's a recruit that has essentially gone into the field of very market-oriented, what oftentimes is referred to as sort of corporate reform organizations. Okay, but it's been a very tacit acceptance over time. So their founder, Wendy Kopp, has been very clear to say we are agnostic. We are silent on we're not going to take an official political position. In the paper, we go into the detail about how this actually looks. But since many of you are familiar with it, I'm not going to go into it that much. So in this paper, then what we did is we take a look at the existing literature on Teach for America. And what we found when we looked across all of the writing, both the scholarly empirical work, the conceptual work, the journalistic work, the the narratives, the sort of self-reported narratives, what we found was that there were sort of four broad types of literature that is growing right now that examines Teach for America in different ways. And the first and the earliest is what we're calling the conceptual debate. So some of you may recall shortly after Teach for America began, Linda Darling Hammond and others had pieces in Phi Delta Kappan and other places where different scholars were coming together to really debate the merits or the trade-offs of TFA. Right? And that remains one of the largest forms of writing on TFA right now. It's not necessarily an empirical body of scholarship. It's really a conceptual one in which different critics and proponents of the organization parse out the trade-offs of Teach for America, the trade-offs of placing fairly under are minimally sort of prepared recruits in challenging settings. The trade-offs of going through a formal university-based teacher preparation program or going through an alternative sort of fast track to become a teacher. And what you see oftentimes in these debates is fairly polarizing language, though, right? Fairly oversimplified dichotomies, right? I oftentimes am asked the question, well, you study TFA, so are you for or against TFA? And I say, I think that's actually an oversimplified question, and I think it's the wrong question to be asking. Not that it's not okay to have strong positions on these things. I just think that there's more to be asked about the organization. Okay, so that's the oldest and still one of the largest forms of literature on TFA. The second, and this is definitely the most rapidly growing work on TFA, is the what works studies, right? The effectiveness studies, like we were talking about earlier, right? And here, for the most part, you see researchers asking or investigating TFA's presumed effects on students' standardized test scores. It's usually test scores. Occasionally, scholars have gone a little beyond the test scores, but for the most part, most of these empirical investigations have measured TFA's effectiveness in terms of test scores. And what we see oftentimes is sometimes we'll see a study come out, we'll say, look, TFA has a positive effect. And when you look, it's a fairly small effect. And then another one will say, look, TFA has a really negative effect, and it's actually a very small effect. Well, what I saw when I looked across all of these studies is that this is mixed, and that to conclude from these effectiveness studies that TFA has any sort of a drastic impact on standardized test scores based on what we know so far in these empirical investigations would be false. Okay. The third type of literature that we see coming out on Teach for America is the TFA narratives, and these are fairly journalistic accounts. This is the Donna Foote work, the Sarah Centillas autobiography, work that peers into the core members' lives and their original motivations for going into TFA. So TFA recruits usually, not always, but usually recent college graduates who really want to do something meaningful in the next stage of their lives. And this seems like, according to these narratives, this seemed like something that they would find to be a meaningful sort of next step for them. What these narratives also help us see, though, is more nuance in their experience. It's not all positive and it's not all negative, but in fact, it's complicated. It's really complicated. And these narratives do a really nice job of unpacking the cultural mismatch oftentimes, or what happens when somebody is underprepared and responsible for the learning of 20 or 35 or however many young children. The last group, and this is the smallest group of literature or collection of literature on TFA, but it's expanding quite a bit. This is the social and political work on TFA. This is the research that conceives of Teach for America recruits not just as volunteer teachers or alternatively trained teachers like we were originally talking about TFA, but as social and political actors that are a part of something larger. So here we have, for example, McAdam and Brandt's study that looks at the civic engagement patterns of TFA alumni, right, where these researchers looked at the degree to which TFA remains or wants to be engaged on a civic level after their commitment ends. We have Beth's work with Kretschmar and others, right, that looks at the social networks that TFA both relies on as well as promotes to engage in their work. And in this the smallest but quickly growing collection of work, you see that we have more critical analyses that are now asking questions about issues of power and how TFA functions to reproduce power. Or these are oftentimes the studies that take up explicit questions of race and ethnicity and power. Okay, this last section this last sort of the four groups of TFA studies. This is the section or the part of the work that we're most interested in exploring and contributing to with this study. So what we've done now, after looking at across the literature and developing that sort of four-part schema of the type of work that has come out on TFA so far, is we've developed an interdisciplinary framework for studying TFA, one that draws on concepts from political science, from political sociology, and from critical policy studies, and also critical leadership studies. I'm going to go into the details of this framework now and then how we have applied it to our current study. Whoops. Look at that. Two slides. So when we argue in the paper that what we need is a way to reconceptualize this organization, we specifically then focus on three sort of anchor concepts to help us rethink Teach for America's activities. The first comes out of political science, and this comes out of the work by Mintram, and this is the work on policy entrepreneurs, and I'll go into that in a moment. The second comes out of political science. This is Domhoff's work on power networks, and the last one that I referred to briefly coming out of critical policy studies is the work on managerialism, and particularly managerialist leadership models that primarily scholars out of the UK, have sort of critiqued in terms of how leaders are sort of conceptualized in the educational reform and educational leadership and educational improvement literature. Okay, so the first, policy entrepreneurs. Mintram argues that this is the notion of public entrepreneurship. And I thought after a conversation at dinner last night, we were talking about, well, what does it mean to be an entrepreneur? So is it necessarily in the service is it necessarily a capitalistic notion? Is it something broader? Well, in the political science world, Mintram has argued that there is this idea of public entrepreneurship where individuals introduce innovation into the public sector. Right? So he also argues that these types of individuals typically promote incentivist or market-based policies that carry with them the same assumptions that you would find in the corporate world, right? About or that include in them sort of market logic. These individuals, it's argued, come from outside of formal positions of government. So they're not a part of the public system. They come from outside of it and attempt to influence it, though. And he argues that policy entrepreneurs tend to orient debates away from questions of resources and equitable distribution toward questions of management and accountability. So if we overlay this notion of what it means to be a policy entrepreneur to TFA and its alumni and the types of career paths and policies and reforms that they come to support or don't support, this is one conceptual lens that we argue can help us better, or help give us new language to talk about what it is that TFA recruits are doing individually, and then the types of impacts that they're having. The second notion, or the second concept, is around power networks. And this comes from Domhoff's work in political sociology. And Domhoff outlines four different elite networks through which four different networks through which elite interests are advanced. So he argues that you can have policy planners, you can have special interest groups, you can have candidate selection processes or selectors, and you can see opinion shapers. And in each of these networks, Domhoff argues, and to give examples of each of these here, in each of these networks, political sociologists argue that you can trace how power and elite interests are advanced, essentially. So it's another way of thinking about the specific relationships that help promote elite interests over more communitarian, perhaps more localized interests. And the last concept that we bring to bear in the framework relates to leadership in particular. So TFA, the rhetoric around TFA, the messaging that it uses now is very much about leadership, about looking for bold, courageous, new, powerful leaders. Govert and Gunter both argue that in order to understand the way we talk about leaders in the school improvement and school reform literature, in much of it, in much of the mainstream literature, we need to we can, in order to understand how we're talking about leadership now, we need to trace it back to management and the roots of business and management. And here we see then that when we talk about leadership, we're talking oftentimes about highly charismatic, but very directive, sort of top-down leaders that focus really on the technocratic dimensions of school change, not necessarily the socio-political dimensions of school change. And they argue that here what we see in this type of literature are fairly decontextualized notions of what it means to be a leader. They talk about what an individual can do in a system without necessarily talking about the racial underpinnings of that system or the different historical legacies that have shaped this system or the different social and political conditions that are at play at any moment in a school system. And they also argue that these types of leaders focus primarily on the managerial purposes of school, the operations of schools, the nuts and bolts of schools, but not necessarily the pedagogical ones. And in doing so, they miss a real opportunity to have deeper conversations or to promote greater awareness about the humanistic purposes of schools and the broader political purposes of schools. And there's this assumption in these types of leadership models, these managerialist leadership models. And it's the assumption that individuals, through sheer perseverance and talent, can drastically improve educational outcomes. This is the kind of language we hear about when TFA highlights some of the accomplishments of its leaders. They very much focus on the individual rather than the individual as embedded in a broader system. And in this field, scholars have argued that when we do this, when we rely on a primarily managerialist model of leadership, what we're doing is we're inadvertently, or perhaps inadvertently, depending on where you stand, diverting our attention away from these systemic inequities, educational inequities. For example, disparities in funding or other resources, or the racial and socioeconomic isolation of whole school systems. And instead, we're focusing just on the power of the individual and what an individual can do. And in doing so, we remove from the conversation considerations about how to shift a system. And instead, it's a focus on what individuals will do. So we argue that these three concepts, I'll go back to them here, the concept of policy entrepreneurs, power networks, and managerialist leaders, if we overlay these onto any investigation of Teach for America, it'll help us illuminate a completely different set of activities and considerations about the organization. So in the paper, we talk briefly about TFA's Anniversary Summit. So as a part of our data collection, a few years ago, we went to, Professor Scott and I traveled to DC to TFA's celebration of its 20th anniversary. We argue in the paper that the just the visual display of this celebration and the ways in which they organized this summit as a networking opportunity for its alumni really helps illustrate how the organization advances these policy entrepreneurs elite networks and how it promotes this certain type of leadership model, this managerialist leadership model. So that's a small case that we use in the paper to animate the contributions of the framework. We're also applying this framework right now to a multi-year study of Teach for America. So right now we've interviewed, I believe it's around 180 alumni that are in a fairly representative sample across the country. Our interviewees, our participants come from about 25 different Teach for America regions. We've also analyzed hundreds of their marketing materials. We're actually going back to for another round of data collection. We're going to focus not just on Teach for America alumni and their organizational staff. That's another group that we've interviewed. But we're actually going to talk more to district leaders, superintendents. We're going to ask them why they're choosing Teach for America, to really understand sort of what it is why practitioners see TFA as a more helpful mechanism for their school district. We've looked at a couple of different dimensions of TFA through this study. One, we've looked at just the organizational messaging patterns. And the other dimension of the organization is that we've looked at their alumni and their current core members' career patterns. So due to come out very soon in the American Journal of Education and eventually another paper yet to be submitted, our analyses are the first empirical analyses from the paper where we use this framework to drive our investigation of the study. So you'll be able to see more examples of sort of how we've applied the framework shortly. So what do we gain from something like this? Well, I argue that a framework like this complements what's already out there, and that it attempts to reframe TFA beyond the traditional renderings as an alternative teacher preparation and placement organization. Many people still talk about Teach for America as those volunteers. They say, oh, you did TFA, or I know somebody who did TFA, or my son did TFA. Yeah, he was a volunteer teacher for a while. And they talk about what it means to be a short-term volunteer teacher. This type of a framework, we argue, helps us expand what we think of when we think about an individual TFA recruit and their purpose. But really what we think about, it also helps us expand what we think of in terms of the entire organization. A framework like this also helps us interrogate why and how TFA leaders are championing market-based approaches to redressing educational inequities, and how they trace the roots of inequality to urban educators rather than broader structural conditions. When we focus on individuals and the power of the individuals and the accomplishments, the potential accomplishments of our individual recruits, for example, rather than focusing on or having a conversation about the broader conditions and the historical reasons for why our schools look the way today, we argue we necessarily narrow the conversation in ways that cut off really other important conversations, social and political conversations about the broader implications of not just Teach for America, but analogous organizations that are operating in a similar manner as Teach for America.